has a bachelor in mathematics and currently is almost exclusively working with information security. And I welcome you to enjoy this analysis and reflection of the current state of open source with Явор Папазов.
Thank you. Check, check. Can you hear me? Okay. Hello, I'm Javor. I want to reflect upon the state of open source software in 2023. So, let me start by summarizing what I'm going to say, so that if you don't find me sufficiently interesting, you can leave early. Jokes aside, I hope that this would be a discussion with everybody. I intend to stop before my time is up, so that we can talk about this, so please stay. But this talk in a nutshell. Open source has won, right? Like, you open a website of a big corporation, there's gonna be something, if you go to the technical department, of course, because we're still sort of the tech gremlins. But, you know, if you go down there, there's going to be something about open source. You know, we proudly sponsor open source. We have this and this and this open source project. So, based on the external criteria, open source has won. And I'm putting this in a bit of a historic perspective. Like, remember SEO v Linux? I'll admit to not having followed that in real time, as I was too busy walking upright under the table. But, you know, I am familiar with the history of that case, and it really feels like, at the time, the fate of open source hanged in the balance. So we won, right? Open source is here. It's more open source than ever. We have to have won, right? And yet, open source was meant to empower users. I'm not going to give you references on these, but, you know, if you go into the old school literature about open source, I think these claims can be substantiated very well. Open source was meant to empower the users. Modern software treats users like cattle. Like, you're, you know, gently pushed into the farm where you can be taken advantage and milked for your data. Like, that doesn't feel like empowering users. Open source brings in billions of value. I don't think anybody is going to argue against that. And yet, critical contributors are severely underpaid and undercompensated. And what to me is, well, I don't know if it's the worst. I just want to pinpoint some things that I'm concerned with. But open source companies cannot, by which I mean the companies that generally are the commercial aspect of an open source project that already exists, cannot withstand competing against those who do not open source. And I'm going to have an example for this. But all of these seem like concerning trends that make me question, did open source win? Okay, what about the subtitle? Well, I'll freely admit it's a bit too pretentious, but what's the point of it? From the Cathedral and the Bazaar to urbanization and gentrification. The Cathedral and the Bazaar is a seminal essay about how open source should be built. Like, whether it should be sort of like planned beforehand, the cathedral model, like you cannot decide how the cathedral is going to look as you build it up. Or the Bazaar, where there's the sort of creative chaos that forges something that's better. Worse is better, if you remember. There was a time when we discussed stuff like this. Turns out the problems we're going to have are not whether we want the Bazaar or a cathedral, but whether or not we want urbanization and gentrification, which would be the fact that, you know, in the real world example of these phenomenon, for urbanization, that would be the fact that you generally have some very poor, usually homeless people in the middle of huge cities, and gentrification, which means that the people who are well off, they're not in the city, they're somewhere else on a sort of a closed gate community or something like this. Now, I'm not particularly fond of this subtitle. I should have dropped it probably, but, you know, it's in the submission, so I kept it, because it sort of drives the conversation into, I guess, more of a political direction, which I don't think is a productive thing. And it's also, today, politics is off. Just a reminder. So I don't want to steer into that direction. But the point is, we thought the problems were how we're going to build stuff. Turns out the problems are how we're going to maintain the ideas, how we're going to maintain the values of open source, how we're going to essentially make it work in the long term, the community, I mean. So, what gives? How did this happen? Is this bad? Like, it seems off to me, but hey, I'm not the judge of the open source community. So, is it bad? Like, do you agree with me? And if you agree with me, how does that stop? Notice that I'm not saying how do we stop it. I think that's very presumptuous, and it would be way too arrogant, even for me, to say that, we will decide in this room how to solve the problem. But I think that some energy needs to be spent on thinking about how does this end. A few words about me. So first of all, this lecture is really not about me, so I was hesitating to even put in this slide. My name is Javor. I'm very passionate about education. I'm an information security professional. I have a very strong dev background. And I really don't have any high-profile contributions to open source. Like, I'm not an Linux kernel developer. If you look at, where Linus wagged his finger towards me, you won't find it. I never contributed. I never put in a patch. I don't. I contribute on a micro level. Like when I see something that I don't like, it's like a small contribution, a small bug fix. I contribute, but I'm not like a core maintainer of some project. So why me? Well, if you find out, let me know. But seriously, I think that sometimes a bit of a distant perspective is better at understanding and realizing the situation and the problems than being right there in the trenches, fighting for open source, quote unquote, every day. So let me start by making some assumptions that I believe that we can probably agree with. The first one that is not listed here, but I believe in it so strongly that I'm just only going to say it, is we all love open source. That's why we're here. So, we want to think about what's the future of open source communities, like do they work as they should, and we want to solve if there are problems. Second one, this is probably the most contentious thing in this entire talk. It's not wrong to profit from your work. Why is it contentious? Because from a political ideology, well, basically half of the compass does not necessarily agree with this statement. I don't want to go into there, but the point is that if you disagree with that, you have to have a fundamental change in society. And let's just say that solving open source doesn't seem like the kind of problem that goes through a revolution first. Like, I'm not interested in this discussion. So we're going to assume that it's not wrong to profit from your work, because assuming otherwise gets us nowhere, essentially. Second assumption, we want money in the open source ecosystem. Like, that's how you grow, in the financial world, money is called usually liquidity, like that's how they refer it. So it's the water. Well, everybody knows life is impossible without water. Economic life is impossible without liquidity. So we want money in the open source ecosystem. That's not a bad thing. That's not what went wrong, in my view. It is unjust for one to take the risk and for another to reap the profits. I think that this is a very important part, that I think is a big part of the problem, that we have very many situations in which one party is taking the risk and another party is taking the profits from that risk, having, worked out. It's hard to blame a corporation for blindly following profits, because that's their job. So, we can't just point out to corporations we don't like. Well, I'm going to do that once or twice, but in general, we cannot point to corporations we don't like and say, oh, you're wrong. No, it's their job to make profit. So, that's not really the part that's fundamentally problematic. But it is fair game to boycott them and to support their competition. Don't worry, I'm not going to go and say, oh, we need to boycott this or that. It's just, we're thinking about what are the tools that we have at our disposal. And finally, OpenFest is good. What do I mean by that? I mean, of course OpenFest is good, you're here. But what I mean is that if the solution that we talk about leads to events such as this not happening, then probably not a good solution. And what do I mean by that? At the end of the day, OpenFest is sponsored by corporate profits. So, how does that fit into my talk? I don't know. These are all, I think, good questions, which is why I'm posing them. And I'm hoping to stop a bit after the middle of the lecture and to have a discussion with you about this. But first, I want to introduce a few data points that I would like to drive the discussion. First of all, I really do not like the way Android works. I'm going to make the rather bold claim that Android is not really an open source project, it's a shared source project. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, there's an opening joke. Google Android is an excellent, a spyware platform with excellent smartphone capabilities. Yeah, that's not exactly true. Operative keyword exactly. Like, Android is a platform that as its, monetary goal needs for us to buy phones and for those phones to display ads to us. Like, that's a job. Okay, but can that be actually a real open source project? And here, I guess, definitions are going to start to come into play. To me, an open source project serves its community. Some people are going to disagree. But the Android open source project, I would argue, does not serve its community. What do I mean by that? Well, if someone were to say, okay, Android is not open source, you would hear the response of, well, you can just fork the Android open source project, right? Right? Well, I would argue that it's not really that simple. First of all, Android will not accept contributions unless they fit Google's vision for that project. Okay, fair game. This is Google's project. But is that really open source? Like, if the users of a certain project want some functionality, let's say ad blocker built it right into the platform, does Google have the right to say no to that? Is this project open source anymore? And you're going to say, okay, you can fork it. Can you really fork it? I'm not convinced this is the case. And yes, there are, successful is a bit of a stretch, but there exist commercially viable forks of Android. But the thing is that if you talk to the people who are involved in there or read what happens, it's an uphill battle for them all the time. Why? Because Android was designed with the idea for it to be hard to fork. Why? There's some deals on the table, like hardware manufacturers with Google. So, those hardware manufacturers will not ship phones with other alternatives to Android and stuff like this. Like, this is all barriers to entry. They were designed to prevent someone from coming in and competing with Android through open source. Is that an open source project? I say no. I say that's a shared source project. And, I just want to remove the blame from the equation. I'm not the person who's going to decide if that's right or wrong. But I think it should be acknowledged that that's not really true open source. True open source moves with its users, and it reacts to their needs and demands. Next point of contention for me, open source and security. So there's this belief that I really want to believe in. Believe me, I really want to believe in that. I just cannot. I work in information security. We've all been told once or more, open source is more secure than proprietary software since anyone can inspect the source code. So let me turn the question to you. Please raise your hand and let me know when's the last time you did a security review of an open source project. Please, let me know that. So, how exactly is open source more secure then? If we, the people who care about open source, do not put in the effort necessary to inspect the source code. For security, by the way, that does not mean, like if you're a qualified developer, that does not mean you can do security review. There's a reason why security is a different profession and a different hat in almost all situations. Dev skills and InfoSec skills, they have an overlap, but they're not the same. So, in open source, dev effort is generally, quote unquote, easy to find. Like, there are people who are willing to contribute. Security efforts, not so much. Why? Because if you are an open source, like if you are a developer and you see a cool project, there, of course you can go and contribute. But what's the alternative? You cannot contribute, which is, okay, but, you cannot really hurt the project by not contributing. For security, this is not the case. For security, if I were to find, and, I would not have my moral backbone in this circumstance. If I were to find an issue in a major open source security project, open source project, I can just sell that on the black market or even on the gray market. There are zero-day vendors who can pay me legally. This all would be legal, the gray hat scenario sort of. I can sell to them the exploit. They'll give me a very, very, very hefty sum of money. Like, off the top of my head, zero-click remote code execution exploit for iPhone is about $1 million. So, that's not a little money. People are going to be motivated by that. So, unfortunately, I say most people who find a vulnerability in open source will not report it to the project. They will sell it. Because this too is an expensive skill set to acquire. Learning to exploit, to find security vulnerabilities is not easy. There's also a funding problem here. Security budgets almost inevitably arrive after the breach. And this is not an open source problem. Let me be clear about that. This particular thing, that's just how we do it, It rained, so I must take the umbrella. No, you should take the umbrella if you think it is going to rain, not if it already rained, right? But we still do it. Why? Because, well, past performance is some sort of indication for the future, right? When we don't have an alternative. Anyway, the problem is that after the breach, many users might have left already. So, first you took the hit, then you take a second hit that your users leave, then you hopefully get some funding to fix the problem. However, since reactive measures are generally less efficient and more costly than proactive measures, that means you're also getting less money effectively. Like, since you're going to have to do cleanup as opposed to prevention, that's more expensive, and therefore you can achieve less. And finally, defensive security is really not cool. Like, if you look at the information security landscape, hacking is the cool thing, not defending. And as an example of that, how many projects, open source projects, have you seen that have a SecOps? So that would be a security automated tooling as part of their DevOps pipeline. Please share. Or if not now, in a few minutes in the discussion. I haven't seen many of those. So I would arrive at the conclusion that the freedom of open source is also a responsibility, one that many users do not take seriously enough. What does that mean? It means that if I install Windows on my laptop, Microsoft is not going to let me not update. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, it's another topic entirely. But the point is, I will be defended maybe against my will. That's not great. I think we in the open source community believe that doing something against your users' will is not good. But the thing is, the result is still present. In open source, you have the freedom to embed something in a piece of hardware, sell it, go bust, and never be bothered about it again. And that has happened. Mirai botnet, I don't know how much, 6 or 7 years ago, something like that. It essentially exploited vulnerabilities in webcams and sort of IoT devices that nobody really cares about. They're out of support. And it got to unimaginable heights in terms of its impact. It's DDoS, so, impact should be taken with a grain of salt, but still, it was record-breaking at the time. And I would say we're all skimming on the bill for security. This is, I think, a common sin. Like, if you use an open source project in your work life, like you have chosen to base something commercial that you're working on an open source project. Do you, tip them a bit for security? Like, I don't know, even $100? That's something, it helps you buy a certificate. It's something. We don't really do it. Sorry? I would certainly not mind for you to take the microphone. Terribly sorry.
Yeah, so, you have put a very hard messages. It's difficult for me to agree with most of them, and I could share my context. So I'm working for an enterprise. We are developing commercial software, but at the same time, in our stack, there are a lot of open source packages. And of course, because we care about our users, we could not allow our commercial software to be vulnerable. And this includes vulnerabilities coming from the open source packages. And because of this, because it's not just the company I'm work for, but this is for me the main case, there are a lot of tools which are actually taking care of this. And just as an example, in order to release a version, I should do a software composite analysis of all packages included, if they're vulnerable, etc. And there are a lot of tools which are keeping track. This package of Node.js is having such kind of vulnerabilities. This Python package is having this kind of vulnerabilities, which is the safest version available at the moment. And this process is going through a constant scanning every day. And if I'm in a hurry to release something and I have a vulnerability blocker in my ecosystem, I have no choice.
Okay.
Apart to fix it. And actually, this is constantly happening. This is just for the part of the open source on top of which there is a kind of a commercial model.
Let me ask you two questions. First of all, is the part that you're describing open source? Because I'm pretty sure it's not. There are vendors who do this, and they, by the way, provide the service generally free to the open source community. But they're not really part of the open source community. They're actually commercial products. And once the incentives switch, their behavior will switch as well.
So their end product is not part of the open source, but their contribution to the underlying packages is actually a contribution.
Yeah, of course. But the thing is, what you're talking about is patch management, essentially. Patch management is a very small part of security. Like, you're talking about mitigating known vulnerabilities. That's one of the many risks. Let me go back one slide and point out something that it's easier to backdoor open source projects. How do you solve this problem? I don't think that the approaches that you described do, because this has been happening. Like, I'm not arguing that you don't have a good security-based culture around open source. And in general, supply chain security is a very hot topic right now. I'm not saying you don't have it in your organization. I'm saying unfortunately, there's an endemic problem that people just do not want to do that. Sorry? You want me to compare open source security to proprietary security? Well, if you insist, let me wrap up the talk and then we can go to this one. This is a contentious one. I'm going to disagree probably with the common thoughts on this one. Not because I want to, believe me. Okay, I'm going to wrap up and then we can continue. So, one more example. I'm pretty sure everybody has seen this at least once. This is an XKCD. I'm sorry, I didn't bother to look up which one exactly, but hey, I've given attribution, which is the part that matters. All modern infrastructure, Babel's towers, multiples of them, Babel's castles, I don't know. And there is at the bottom of it one package. Now, I'm gonna scratch Nebraska here, and, turns out it's Russia, but kind of the same, not really that big of a difference. This is about CoreJS, and it's author Denis Pushkarev. I believe it's pronounced. I don't really know. First of all, let me say I don't know that person. I have read his story, and it struck me as something that's unjust. So I'm talking about it. But I haven't met him in person. I don't know. And the second thing is the bottom bullet. I would say there's a quote unquote happy resolution in this case because this man has been denied funding for his work while everybody else got to use it. Finally, he's got some funding. The part on the right is the npm.js page for CoreJS. So, there are a few major sponsors, a few logos that I can recognize. And there are a bunch of small, independent individuals who have taken, responsibility for this. I don't know why, but it concerns me that the second list is so big while the first one is so small. I know why. I get it. There's a war going on. It's actually pretty close to Bulgaria, as a matter of fact, concerning a close, one might say. I get that companies don't want to get involved in that, but is Denis Pushkarev the person who has to pay the price? Because if you read his story, which I, implore you to, you'll find out that he has been mistreated by the open source community in a pretty grave degree. He has been giving CoreJS all he has, in terms of not being able to hold a different job because there's too much work to be done on CoreJS. And sure, you can say, what person does this? Of course, you're going to have to prioritize, the well-being of your family and of yourself before you go and, contribute to a project that's so big that it can take your entire life and still have a lot more work to be done. But I would argue that's a bit of a weird approach. Shouldn't we, the recipients of the benefits from CoreJS, shouldn't we be chipping in? Probably yes. I think that's why once this got very public, and there was a GitHub post on the CoreJS, GitHub not post, it's a wiki page, I think. I don't recall where it was, but you can read it, it's very easy to find, where he essentially goes over his life story, why things are the way they are, why he cannot leave Russia, and he cannot come to the West and work for because that's what people tell him, why are you asking for money for CoreJS? Just go work for one of the big tech. Well, turns out he can. He cannot leave Russia. So, Denis has taken the risk of developing CoreJS. He has taken the risk of his work not being needed, then of his work not being good, and then of his work not being maintained. And we have all taken the profits. Are we the baddies? A little bit, I would say. I guess almost final, because we won't have that much time, but MongoDB versus AWS. I don't know if you have heard that story, but I'm going to run through it pretty fast. and a bit loose. There may be some minor details that I'm omitting that matter. But, you know, MongoDB is kind of cool, right? Amazon seems to think so. They like it so much that they started selling MongoDB as a service. Okay, you know, nothing fundamentally wrong with that. The open source license of MongoDB allows for it. Problem is that Amazon does not develop MongoDB. MongoDB Incorporated develops MongoDB. And turns out if you steal, that's overreach. If you take the money from from the people who are developing the product suffers. And that's what happened. Because, sure, MongoDB has their own database as a service offering, but the one in Amazon is one click away from being deployed. I need to register for MongoDB. And so at the end of the day, what happens is MongoDB tried to compete with AWS, but they were unable to. So they had to change their license to SSPL, server-side public license, if memory serves me correctly, which is very similar to AGPL. AGPL is an open source, right? Who agrees that AGPL is an open source? Who disagrees that AGPL is open source? Okay, cool. You don't really know what AGPL is for the most of the people. That's okay. AGPL is the license that says if I'm to interact with your program through network, you need to give me the program source code. Of course, if the program contains some AGPL source code. So it's kind of the way to solve the quote-unquote problem with GPL, wherein by separating the proprietary and the open source software on different machines, you say, okay, you know, this is proprietary, so it doesn't really interact with the open source, so it can stay proprietary. AGPL says no. If it was meant to communicate with open source software, it's open source as well. SSPL is a very similar step. There's a reason why they didn't use AGPL directly. I'm not going to go over it because it's detailed, it's lawyer speak. There's some risk about AGPL not having had major court cases about it, so they asked their lawyers, write us a bit more detailed AGPL. AWS took no risk. AWS jumped on that bandwagon when MongoDB was very popular. AWS took most of the profits too. So, you know. What I'm a bit irked about is how the OSI, the open source initiative, reacted to this. The SSPL is not an open source license, they assert. And I'm going to read, I don't know if you can read from the background. We've seen that several companies have abandoned their original dedication to the open source community by switching their core products from an open source license, one approved by the open source initiative, to a full pen source license. The hallmark of a full pen source license is that those who made the switch claim that their product continues to remain open under the new license, but the new license actually has taken away user rights. That's a really high horse you're riding there, OSI. I wonder who paid for the equestrian exercises, huh? That's from OSI's website. You know, it's not my place to judge the OSI. Let me say that. You know, and in general, if I sound like I lack humility, I apologize, because this lecture needs to be delivered with humility, first and foremost. I will not solve these problems. We probably will not solve these problems. But the thing is, I'm not blind either. You know, you come up with a take like this, on a license that essentially made to reduce the money that's coming into your core sponsor. Doesn't look great. Anyway, so, you know, there's a way to hot take. I don't agree with this one. There's a reason why I scratch it. But the thing is, there's a grain of truth underneath it. You know, open source, again, I do not agree with this statement. But I think it's meaningful to hear it said. Open source is a grift, and the people who believe in open source are the ones being grifted. I think there's a grain of truth to that. I don't think this is true, however. Okay, and final topic, because we gotta talk as well. Abandonware. So major corporations dump open source, quote-unquote open source, without any intention of maintaining it. I have a personal example of it. I'm not going, this isn't, you know, a character assassination on Microsoft. Microsoft doesn't care about me, and I generally don't care about Microsoft. But I saw they have a router OS scanner. It's a repository that scans router OS devices, so Microtic. And I was like, yeah, well, my home network's Microtic. You know, that sounds cool. Let me run it. It wanted passwords. I don't use passwords for SSH on my local network. Some questions for Microsoft here, by the way, but hey, what do I know about networks? I don't use SSH passwords. I use SSH keys. So I made the trivial change to the software to be able to work with SSH keys, at least with SSH agent. Right? And I opened an MR. I don't know if you can see the date. It's April 3rd, 2022. there's been zero response, zero comments, and basically zero engagement. I'm not going to get this merged. I get it, but why? Why? It's, I don't know if you can see it. It's file changed 1. It's like 5 lines of change. The project has continued to be on some sort of life support. They eventually merged their dependabot MRs or PRs, I suppose. They just didn't even bother looking at this. And it referred to one of the issues that was open, not by me, by someone before me, a few months ago. No interaction. Piggybacking. Basically going to quote-unquote contribute to an open source project in the early stage so that you can use it as a PR or sales vehicle, or to use it for political or strategical purposes. The one that I'm going to name, not a project, a practice. I don't want to talk about, like, this is just an example that I've had, and so I feel that it's fair. And it's also not a very, it's not a very big deal. That's why I'm giving it as an example. But for the last example, I want to say, I've noticed a trend where corporations, when you think that someone is going to compete with you on X, you open source something in X. And now, all of a sudden, any commercial product that will actually need to make money because they took money for the innovation cannot compete. This would be perfectly okay if the open source project was actually intended to serve the users, but it's not. It's intended to reduce innovation. That's a very toxic pattern. And, maybe I'm just seeing things. It's perfectly possible. I said I work in information security. Security folks, they tend to get a little bit out there. I don't think I'm immune to this. But there's too many data points here for me to just assume a coincidence. This is all I had to say. I'm going to ask you now to have a discussion, and hopefully not just with me, but with all of us. And this is a few points that I hope that can lead us in discussion. The red is things I do not think are good. The black is things I think are hard to change. So, hopefully we can, if you agree with me that the red things are bad, we can shoot them down while not having to go through the things that are hard to change, like open source business models, or the fact that software nowadays is funded largely by ads, which I would argue is the most fundamental problem that we're observing. And everything else is mostly a sort of a third iteration of this core problem. Okay, thank you. Please, let me put my Kevlar vest.
Test. This works. Okay. Excellent topic, actually. I was thinking on the same subjects a while ago. My topic was open source won all the battles, but free software lost the war.
Yeah, I love this framing.
Did you actually go in the direction that against Cathedral and Bazaar? Because I want to reject Cathedral and Bazaar because it thinks about the house, and we knew why we want to do free software. Yeah. 10 years earlier, or maybe even more years earlier. So actually, generally, I agree with your perception, and I just think that we need to focus more on the idea of free software and not on the house of open source. Except for the security thing, I think you're too much comparing things you do know against things we don't know, which happens somewhere in the black box. Yeah. This was not a question, but just
No, it's a discussion. I don't think it has to be a question. I'm hoping that other people chime in as well. Just to say, I definitely agree with the framing of free versus open. Like, this is what we've kind of lost, freedom, not openness. Source is widely available now, but GitHub feels like a hosting platform, not an open source platform. Well, not a free software platform. And the second thing about the Cathedral and the Bazaar, yes, I do agree that the Cathedral and Bazaar just seems quaint nowadays when you read it. It's like a very beautiful essay on how things are going to be. Turns out how was not the problem. It was, how to build it was not the problem. The problem turned out to be entirely different. So yeah, I accept that premise. Thank you very much.
So I have a few sort of old-fashioned thoughts on TiVoization and shared source. I mean, I think the biggest problem these days is devoization, which, for people not familiar with the term, basically means hardware where the source is shared, if things are nominally open source, but it doesn't matter because you can't run it yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, back in the 90s, I worked in an OS research group where we licensed the source code to a commercial Unix. And even though that wasn't open source, we could actually do with it what we wanted.
Yeah.
We could modify it and boot it on the workstations that we had and run experiments and stuff. These days, like, just try doing that on an iPhone, for example, if you wanted to do research. So it's just, I think the lack of the ability of a user to control their own device is, I think, the biggest problem that open source faces going down the road.
I wouldn't, what you said, I would agree with it. I don't know if I would say it's the largest problem. I just don't feel qualified to make that statement. So, I wouldn't say another one is the largest either. But yes, I agree. And arguably, IoT should have had a bullet here, because IoT is a very big problem. And plant obsolescence in general. Like, if you manufacture hardware with the intention to throw it away in 2 years, of course the software, it doesn't matter. The assumption of the vendor is that the hardware doesn't matter, let alone the software. Why are you asking to upload new code on it? This device, you were meant to throw it away. Well, maybe I don't want to. Maybe that's the freedom we lost. So yeah, thank you.
I have a very probably weird question, but first let's preface it. I'm not a developer. I'm an infrastructure guy at heart mostly. So maybe I'm too far away from this. I probably contributed mostly like bug like issues and a couple of documentation fixes here and there.
Now those small contributions, I think, are the thing that does not get enough, I don't know, credit in the open source community, because like most of the bugs you encounter are going to be small. And that's the difference. Like, most open source projects will not accept a contribution like this, which to me is a bad thing. Sorry to interrupt.
I think some of them are still open.
Some of them are still open, yeah.
Anyway, thanks. My question would have been is that, do you really think it's actually worse what our colleague who was talking before that about his company contributing to open source packages because their proprietary software was having like a security or other kind of issue? Do you think it's worse if this happens because of that, or the other way around, them not even be able to contribute? Like, doesn't this make it?
I think it's a great thing. Like, you should be contributing. If you're a commercial entity that uses open source software, you should most certainly contribute to it. The problem is not to try to skew the open source project to best fit your needs. The problem is to understand that you're not the only user, and that in open source, money is not the only currency. Like, because what I would interpret as happening in many situations, such as these that I described, is that a sponsor comes in and says, we have a big pockets, so we're going to fund you, but you're going to do this. That's not open source. That maybe it is, just doesn't fit what I believe is open source. Open source is whoever comes in, if they can agree with the rest of, whether it's a governance board, it doesn't really matter whether it's a foundation, if they can agree on the direction of the software, then they join the common stream. There's a reason why we call it upstream, right? If you don't agree, fork it. Fork the most minimal part that you can. Also very important. A lot of people are trying to fork huge projects because they disagree with something super small. Fork the smallest possible amount. And, work from that perspective. Don't come and try to change existing open source projects that have built communities to try and become something else. And the example I would give, for example, is Audacity, the open source audio software. I don't know what happened ultimately with this one, but they were sort of bought. Someone needs to explain to me how you buy an open source project, by the way, but they were bought, and the new owners wanted to insert some, malvertising in there. I'm going to be probably not enough politically correct, but the point is, they were just ready to create yet another vehicle for extracting user data out of Audacity. Like, that's not how you interact with an open source project. That's wrong. That's what I'm saying. Thank you. Nobody? Come on. Tell me I'm wrong.
So there are, I think there are at least kind of 3 different threads in your presentation, which maybe need a separate conversation around. One was when an individual developer decides to invest all of their time into a kind of core infrastructure project, CoreJS example, how do we care for, like, how do we provide support and care for this individual person? I think the best solution for that is for that person to give up maintaining the project, and it's totally their choice to do it, right? Whatever you say about their what other opportunities they had in their life, if they like to do this, they should do it. If it's too much for them, they should stop doing it. The other thing you said, the other thread was around a single company open source projects like MongoDB, and there are a bunch of other examples.
Yeah. MongoDB is the one
many.
that spawned SSPL. That's why it got it. But there are many examples,
including MariaDB and their
that lecture is ongoing right now, I believe.
Yeah, and their attempts at doing database as a service, competing with AWS. I think the main problem there is that a lot of these, a whole crop, maybe 15 years of open source companies being founded who didn't really understand what we understand now in terms of the game that the hyperscalers, especially infrastructure as service clouds like Amazon, Google, Microsoft are playing. And because of that, they had the wrong license.
Yeah.
From the beginning, they had the wrong license. And I think if someone's founding a MongoDB-like company today, they wouldn't use the license that MongoDB was using.
But would they be using an open source license? Because the OSI says SSPL is no open source.
Well, that's the question of, do we treat AWS as just another natural person, or we don't? And I think we shouldn't. They're not the same as we shouldn't apply the same freedoms and rights to these huge companies because they exploit them in bad ways. Because when you treat them like a natural person, they use these rights against you, right? They steal your work and etc. And that's the a matter of definitions. And the OSI example you gave is something around there. What was the third thread?
Maybe I can respond to the first two because I might forget. And then you get to the third, of course. But I want to respond. So, first of all, I don't disagree about Denis Pushkar. If you want to dedicate your life to some mission, goal, vision, whatever it is that floats your boat, you have the right to do so. But you also don't have the right to tell other people, well, it didn't work out for me, so now you owe me. Problem is that it worked out for him. To me, that's the problem. And so, to continue to enjoy the fruits of his labor is immoral in the sense that it's like, oh no, he enjoys it. No, he does not enjoy it. That's why he asks for money. That's the real problem. And if huge open source, huge companies, if they had created a fork of CoreJS that says, we're going to be taking care of this now, and they had their corporate governance board and so on installed, that would be different, because this would also disincentivize Mr. Pushkar from having to contribute. Because from his perspective, if he doesn't contribute to CoreJS, CoreJS dies. I think that's overdoing it a little bit. I think the death of a project of this size will be much slower than probably he gives it credit, but it's clear that he has passion and that someone's taking advantage of that. This is what, to me, is wrong. And for the second one, agree wholeheartedly, AWS is a utility company. We just don't have the framework to explain that yet. Cloud is a utility, especially if it continues to be ever present. Then you want to be a cloud provider? That's fine. You get to compete with the other cloud providers, not with the service providers. Because to me, this is the fundamental problem. If you have both the lower layer and the upper layers, then you're locking everybody else out of competing with you. And there's a reason why, for example, in the US, there's laws. Like if you're, am I out of time? If you're I don't know, an energy company, you can't say, I don't allow these devices on my network, because that's not your job. You have a very limited set of freedoms, as you call them, to perform commercially, And those are limited to what you would be doing as a utility company. And so yes, to me, AWS, Azure, and the GCP platform, they're all utility companies. And one day, they will have to get there, because otherwise I don't know how innovation continues. The third one?
Let's talk about that later. I think the kind of your last remark it assumes that the U.S. government will break up the big
not ours.
hyperscalers.
Not ours.
Yeah, which is not guaranteed. Like it may take another 30 years before like a serious antitrust action is taken against the big guys.
Agreed. I'm optimistic.
Or ever.
Like that.
Like it might never happen.
Yeah, fair point. Thank you. We out of time, or do we have? We're out of time. Okay. Well, you can find me and tell me I'm wrong in the hallways. Thank you very much.
Yeah.